The silence inside the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism was not a natural quiet. It was a heavy, manufactured stillness that pressed against the eardrums like deep-sea water. High above the valley of Tekaluka, the fortress stood as a monolith of white concrete and jagged steel, a place where time didn't flow so much as it stagnated. Elias, a lead officer, whose face was as weathered as the cliffs surrounding the prison, walked the perimeter of Sector 4. His boots made no sound on the polished floors, a testament to the discipline that governed every square inch of this facility. This was the opening hour of a new watch, and tonight the atmosphere felt particularly thin. CECOT was designed for 40,000 of the most dangerous individuals on the planet, men who had once turned streets into battlegrounds. Now they were shadows in blue uniforms, living in a world without clocks, without mirrors, and without the chaos they once craved. Elias stopped at a heavy iron gate, his hand hovering over the electronic scanner. He knew the names of the men in these cells better than he knew his own neighbors. They were the remnants of a darker age, kept behind 7 layers of reinforced steel and constant surveillance. New transport at the main gate, a voice crackled through his earpiece. It was unusual for a transfer to arrive at this hour. Usually, the logistics of moving such high-risk cargo were handled under the blinding glare of the midday sun to ensure absolute visibility. A late arrival meant something had changed in the outside world. Elias moved toward the intake plaza. As the massive exterior doors groaned open, the humid night air of El Salvador rushed in, clashing with the sterile, conditioned air of the interior. A single armored bus sat idling, its blacked-out windows reflecting the harsh floodlights like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. When the hydraulic ramp lowered, only one man stepped out. He was not shouting or resisting. He was terrifyingly still. The prisoner was known in the underworld as the Architect. Unlike the others, his skin was clear of the typical gang tattoos, but his reputation was written in the ledgers of every intelligence agency in the hemisphere. He looked at the towering walls of CECOT not with fear, but with the calculated gaze of a man measuring a challenge. Elias felt a cold shiver trace down his spine. He had seen thousands of men pass through these gates, but the Architect's eyes held a spark of intelligence that did not belong in a place meant to extinguish it. "Cell Block 7, Elias commanded, his voice steady despite the growing unease. The guards surrounded the newcomer, their movements synchronized, professional, and entirely devoid of hesitation. As they led the Architect into the depths of the complex, the heavy gates hissed shut behind them, sealing the world away once more. Elias watched the monitor as the prisoner was processed. There was a legend that no one ever left CECOT, and that the walls themselves were infused with the weight of forgotten sins. But as the Architect vanished into the labyrinth of the prison, Elias could not shake the feeling that the silence of the facility was about to be tested. The first chapter of a new, dangerous era had begun within the White Walls, and the most dangerous human on Earth had just found his new home. The game of shadows had officially commenced. The sun hung heavy over the valley of Tekaluka, its heat striking the white concrete of the Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo. It was a fortress of silence. Inside these walls, time did not tick. It settled like dust on the shoulders of the forgotten. Captain Elias Vance stood at the checkpoint, his uniform crisp despite the oppressive humidity. He was a man of iron discipline, a human wall in a place designed to contain the uncontainable. CECOT was a marvel of modern engineering and ancient dread. 8 pavilions of reinforced steel were surrounded by a perimeter of high-voltage fences and watchtowers that never blinked. It was more than a prison. It was a final destination. Here, the shadows of the past were held in check by the unwavering light of the present. Vance checked his tactical watch. The transport was exactly 4 minutes away. The rumble of the armored convoy echoed against the volcanic slopes long before the dust clouds appeared. This was not a standard transfer. The orders had come from the highest levels of government, encrypted and urgent. Usually, CECOT housed the architects of local chaos and street warfare, But today, the air felt different. It was thicker, charged with a strange static energy. As the heavy steel gates groaned open, hydraulic pistons hissing, the convoy rolled into the main courtyard. Guards in tactical gear formed a corridor of black Kevlar and steady rifles. Vance stepped forward, his boots clicking against the asphalt. He approached the lead vehicle, a massive, windowless transport that looked more like a mobile vault than a bus. "Status report," Vance barked, his voice cutting through the hum of the idling diesel engines. "Subject is secure, Captain," the lead transport officer replied, his hands trembling slightly as he handed over the digital manifest. "But we have never seen anything like this. The containment protocols were extreme, even for our standards." Vance swiped the tablet, his eyes narrowing as he read the redacted files. There was no name, only a designation: Subject 0 Alpha. The crimes listed were not just violent, they were statistically impossible. He was a ghost in the machine who had finally been cornered, a mind that could supposedly predict the movements of its captors. The back doors of the transport swung open with a heavy thud. A chilled mist, pumped in to keep the occupants sedated, rolled out on the hot ground. From the white fog emerged a specialized containment pod. It was a vertical sarcophagus of glass and carbon fiber. Inside sat a man who looked deceptively ordinary, yet his stillness sent a shiver down Vance's spine. The man's eyes opened. They were not the eyes of a madman. They were deep pools of terrifying intelligence. He did not look at the rifles. He looked directly at Captain Vance and smiled a thin, knowing smile. It was a smile that suggested the walls of CECOT, thick as they were, might not be thick enough. "Welcome to your new home," Vance said. As the pod was wheeled toward Pavilion 1, the wind picked up, howling through the electrified wires. The guards watched in silence. The legend of CECOT's most dangerous guest had begun. Deep within the concrete labyrinth, the shadow seemed to stretch, welcoming the man who would either be their king or destruction. The transition from the scorching Salvadoran sun to the air-conditioned sterility was jarring. Captain Elias Vance felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. His boots, polished to a mere sheen, struck the linoleum with a rhythmic cadence that seemed to echo for miles. Here, the world of the living was replaced by a world of the contained. He was joined by Sergeant Mateo, a man whose face was a roadmap of scars and stories. "He's been asking for you, Captain," Mateo said, his voice a low rumble. They were heading toward Sector 3, the deepest heart of the facility, where the most notorious individuals were housed. Unlike the communal cells where hundreds slept on tiered steel bunks, Sector 3 was a place of isolation and absolute observation. The walls here were not just concrete, they were reinforced with lead and sensors designed to detect even the slightest vibration. CECOT was not just a cage, it was a living, breathing machine of surveillance. As they passed the glass-fronted command center, Vance glanced at the wall of monitors. Thousands of tiny squares depicted the inhabitants, all dressed in identical white, their heads fixed on nothingness. It was a sea of captured lightning, a storm held by glass. "Has he eaten?" Vance asked, his eyes focused on the heavy titanium door at the end of the corridor. "Not a bite. He just sits there, staring at the corner of the ceiling like he is counting the molecules in the air," Mateo replied, his hand resting instinctively on his holster. "He knows things, Elias, things that should not be known inside these walls." They reached the final threshold. The door to Pavilion 7 required 3 separate biometric scans. First, the retina, then the palm. Finally, a voice-coded phrase that changed every hour. As the heavy bolts retracted with a sound like a distant thunderclap, the air grew noticeably heavier. This was where the most dangerous human on Earth was kept. He did not have a name anymore, only a designation: Inmate 001. Rumor had it he had orchestrated entire wars from a basement in a city that no longer exists. Now, he was the crown jewel of Vance's collection. Vance stepped into the small observation booth overlooking Cell 001. The man inside was sitting perfectly still. He was lean, with silver hair and hands that looked as delicate as a pianist's. He did not look like a monster, which Vance knew was his most lethal trait. "Good morning, Julian," Vance said into the intercom. The man in the cell did not move his head, but a slow, thin smile spread across his lips. "Captain Vance, you are late. I was beginning to think you had finally succumbed to the heat outside. It would be a shame to lose the only man who knows how to listen." Vance gripped the edge of the console. Every word out of 001's mouth was a calculated gamble. "I am not here to listen today. I am here to find out how you managed to send a message to the outside world yesterday." Vance felt the back of his neck prickle as the hidden sensors hummed in the background. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Julian finally looked up, his eyes piercing through the reinforced glass with an intensity that made the modern fortress feel like a house of cards. "Messages are like water, Captain. They always find the path of least resistance." The steel doors of Sector 4 groaned with a mechanical heaviness that felt more like a warning than a welcome. As Captain Elias Vance stepped through the threshold, the ventilation hum intensified, a constant, low-frequency vibration that rattled the marrow of his bones. This was the heart of the beast, the place where the world's most violent histories were bound by rebar and high-tensile steel. Standing by the primary observation console was Warden Mendez. She didn't turn when he approached, her eyes fixed on the grid of monitors, illuminating her face in flickering blue. "You're late, Elias," she said, her voice cutting through the mechanical drone. "The heat at the perimeter was slowing the logistics team," Vance replied, coming to a halt beside her. He looked down through the reinforced glass of the mezzanine. Below them lay the first tier of the high-security block. It was a labyrinth of immaculate, shadowless white. The cells were arranged in a honeycomb pattern, designed to maximize visibility while ensuring total isolation. "They aren't just prisoners," Mendez whispered, gesturing towards a screen showing Cell 102. "They are the architects of chaos. Every man in this wing has a story that could keep a city awake at night. Here, we give them the only thing they deserve: silence." Vance watched a figure in the cell below. The man was sitting perfectly still on a concrete slab, his back against the wall. He wore the standard white uniform, his skin a roadmap of tattoos that told tales of old allegiances and forgotten wars. Even from this distance, the intensity radiating from the man was palpable. He didn't move a muscle, yet he seemed to dominate the small space by sheer force of will. "That's number 742, Mendez noted, sensing Vance's gaze. "Formerly a high-ranking lieutenant of the Northern cartels. He hasn't spoken a word in 14 months. Not to the guards, not to the chaplains, not even to himself in the dead of night. He sits and waits, a predator in a state of permanent hibernation." "Waiting for what?" Vance asked, his fingers brushing the cold leather of his holster. "For the world to forget his crimes," she said grimly, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Or perhaps for the foundations of this fortress to fail. Neither will happen while I draw breath, Elias. We are the dam holding back a flood of absolute malice." Vance felt the gravity of her words settle into his skin like lead. CECOT wasn't just a prison. It was a modern sarcophagus for the living. Every inch of the architecture was meticulously designed to strip away the ego, to reduce a man to a number and a heartbeat. Yet, looking at the silent figures on the monitors, Vance couldn't shake the creeping feeling that the stillness was a calculated deception. It wasn't the silence of genuine peace. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a held breath, the momentary pause before a devastating storm breaks. He checked his tactical watch, the glowing digits marking the relentless passage of time. The shift change was approaching, but the tension in his chest refused to subside. Every corridor they walked, every magnetic lock they engaged, reinforced the terrifying reality of their heavy charge. They were the jailers of monsters, and in the profound stillness of the Tekaluka Valley, the monsters were always listening, learning the rhythm of the guards' boots. Vance took a deep breath, the recycled air filling his lungs, and prepared for the long shift. The silence in Sector 4 was different from the silence outside. Outside, it was the absence of sound. Here, it was the suppression of it. Captain Elias Vance walked down the central gangway, a raised metal platform that allowed guards to look down into the communal holding areas. Below him, hundreds of men sat in rows on the floor. They wore white shorts, their torsos bare, revealing a mosaic of ink that chronicled lifetimes of violence. Each tattoo was a map of a war that the government had finally decided to win. Vance's gaze lingered on the sea of shorn heads. There were no beds here, only the cold concrete. The prisoners didn't look up as he passed. In CECOT, eye contact was a currency most could no longer afford. He reached the end of the walkway where a single reinforced observation window overlooked a specialized isolated armies from the shadows of the slums. "Status report," Vance said, his voice sounding brittle in the sterile air. A younger guard, Sergeant Ortega, snapped to attention. "Cell block Alpha 1 is secured, Captain. Inmate 704 has been quiet since the transfer. No movement, no requests." Vance stepped closer to the glass. Behind it sat a man whose name had once paralyzed the city of San Salvador with fear. Mateo Silva, known as El Cuervo, sat perfectly still. He wasn't like the others below. His skin was clear of tattoos, a mark of his high-ranking status that required him to blend into the civilian world he had sought to dismantle. Silva looked up then, his eyes locking onto Vance's reflection in the glass. It wasn't a look of defiance, but one of terrifying patience. "He knows why you're here, sir," Ortega whispered, shifting his weight. Vance didn't respond. He was thinking about the intelligence report sitting on his desk. The report spoke of a coded message intercepted 3 days ago, a message that shouldn't have been possible to send from within these walls. The walls were supposed to be impenetrable, the jamming technology absolute. Yet the ghost of a command had drifted out into the streets, and people were dying again. He felt the weight of his sidearm, a heavy reminder of the fragility of the peace they had built. CECOT was designed to be a tomb for the living, a place where the past went to die. But as Vance stared at Silva, he saw a flicker of something that looked dangerously like hope in the prisoner's dark eyes. It was a silent challenge, a crack in the concrete facade of the prison's invincibility. "Keep a double watch on him," Vance ordered, finally breaking the stare. "I want a full log of every breath he takes. If he so much as blinks out of rhythm, I want to know." As he turned to leave, the low-frequency hum of the ventilation seemed to shift in pitch, turning into a mournful groan that resonated through the floorboards. Vance walked away, his boots clicking against the metal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the predator behind the glass was no longer the one being hunted. He was halfway to the exit when a sudden, sharp metallic clang echoed from the lower levels, a sound that sliced through the artificial silence like a blade. It was followed by a chilling, unified chant, a low, rhythmic thumping of palms against stone, that signaled the silence of CECOT was merely a mask for a brewing storm. Van stopped at the far end of the gangway, where a metal floor transitioned into a heavy, reinforced glass observation deck. Below, the rows of inmates were arranged with a geometric precision that felt more like a warehouse of souls than a correctional facility. There were no personal belongings, no splashes of color, and certainly no hope visible in the posture of the men who sat on their concrete bunks. The hum of the ventilation system was louder here, a mechanical heartbeat that served as the only soundtrack to this subterranean existence. "It is a masterpiece of modern order, isn't it, Captain?" A voice rasped from the shadows of the control booth. Vance turned to see Warden Ares, a man whose face looked as though it had been carved from the very volcanic rock that surrounded the valley.
Aris didn't move to shake hands. He simply stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on the flickering wall of monitors that displayed every inch of the facility. Each screen was a silent window into a different cell, a different story of violence now suppressed by cold, hard reality. The control room smelled of ozone, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic halls. "Order is one word for it," Vance replied, his voice level despite the unease that continued to prick at the nape of his neck. "I've seen high-security blocks before, but nothing that feels quite like this. The air itself feels heavy." Aris stepped forward into the dim light, his uniform pressed. "That is the weight of justice, Vance. For decades, these men were the ones who dictated the rhythm of life in our streets. They were the ones who brought the silence of the grave to innocent families. Now we have returned that silence to them. In CECOT, time does not heal anything. It simply waits." The warden gestured toward a specific screen in the corner, labeled Cell Block Alpha 9. On the monitor, a single man sat cross-legged, his back against the cold stone wall. Unlike the others, who seemed to slump under the weight of their confinement, this individual sat perfectly upright. His skin was a tapestry of dark ink, a history of crime written in symbols that Vance knew all too well. "Who is he?" Vance asked, leaning closer to the glass. "The one they call El Azote," Aris whispered. "The Scourge. He was the architect of the 3-day blackout 5 years ago. He hasn't spoken a word since he was processed 6 months ago. Not to the guards, not to the chaplains, not even to the other inmates. He simply watches." As if sensing the gaze of the men above, the prisoner slowly lifted his head. Even through the grainy resolution of the security camera, Vance felt a jolt of recognition. There was no rage in the man's eyes, only a terrifyingly calm calculation. It was the look of a predator who understood that even the strongest cage had a seam, a point of failure that only patience could reveal. Vance looked back at the warden. "He doesn't look broken." "He isn't," Addis admitted, his voice dropping to a low growl. "And that is exactly why you are here, Captain. We've noticed a pattern in the shifts, a subtle change in the way the others react when he moves. The silence in Sector 4 is deep, but something is beginning to stir beneath the surface. I need you to find the crack before the dam breaks."
The glass beneath Vance's boots felt surprisingly thin, a transparent barrier between the law and the lawless. From this height, the men below looked less like humans and more like biological components in a vast, silent engine. They moved only when commanded, their gestures stripped of all individuality, their lives reduced to a series of sharp angles and absolute obedience. This was the vision of Tekaluka, a world where the noise of the streets was finally silenced. Every inmate was a shadow, a ghost in a body that no longer belonged to him. It's a masterpiece of logistics, wouldn't you agree, Captain? The voice was dry, like sandpaper over stone. Vance turned to see Warden Arturo Moretti standing at the edge of the deck. Moretti was a man who seemed carved from the very concrete that housed his charges. His uniform was so crisp it appeared brittle, and his eyes, a pale blue, held the stillness of a stagnant well. He didn't offer a hand. He simply stood beside Vance, looking down at the sea of white-clad figures with pride. "It's efficient," Vance replied, his voice sounding foreign in the air of the observation deck. "But efficiency usually implies a finished product. What is the product here, Warden? Is it rehabilitation?" Moretti smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "The product is peace, Captain. We harvest the chaos of the outside world and store it here,
where it can no longer bloom. Every man you see below was once a catalyst for destruction. Here they are merely variables in an equation of absolute containment. We do not seek to change them. We only seek to end their influence. Vance looked back down. In the third row of the nearest quadrant, a man sat perfectly still. Unlike the others, who kept their gazes fixed on the floor or the blank walls as instructed, this inmate had his chin tilted slightly upward. It was a subtle rebellion, a fraction of a degree, but in a place defined by geometric perfection, it was as loud as a scream. "Who is he?" Vance asked, pointing toward the man. Moretti leaned forward, his gaze narrowing. "He is inmate 704. In his former life, he was known as the Ghost. He was the lead strategist for the most ruthless syndicate in the Northern Territories. He didn't pull triggers, he pulled strings. He specialized in making things and people disappear." As if sensing their scrutiny, inmate 704 slowly shifted his gaze. His eyes were not filled with the frantic desperation Vance had seen in other prisons. Instead, they were cold, analytical, and unsettlingly focused. He wasn't looking at the guards or the walls. He was looking directly through the reinforced glass, locking eyes with Vance. It was a predatory look, one that suggested he wasn't the one being observed, but rather the one doing the observing. "He looks like he's waiting for something," Vance whispered. Moretti's jaw tightened. "They are all waiting, Captain. That is the cruelty of time here. It passes, but it leads nowhere. He can look all he wants, but the glass is thick and the steel is thicker. There is no string left." Vance wanted to believe him, but the way 704's lips twitched, a faint ghost of a smile, made his skin crawl. The warden walked away, his footsteps echoing. Vance remained at the glass, unable to look away from the man who refused to be a mere variable. The silence of Sector 4 had suddenly become a lot more deafening.
Vance turned away from the observation deck, the squeak of his rubber soles against the glass sounding like a sharp, involuntary intake of breath in the oppressive stillness. He moved toward the heavy hydraulic elevator that served as the sole gateway to the subterranean levels, the specialized units they never showed the visiting dignitaries or the international press. This was where the ghosts were kept, the men whose crimes were so heinous that their very names had been struck from the public record, replaced by cold alphanumeric sequences. As the lift descended, the hum of the facility shifted. It transitioned from a low ambient vibration to a rhythmic, heavy thrum, like the mechanical heartbeat of a sleeping titan. The air grew thinner here, recycled through filters that couldn't quite strip away the metallic tang of old electricity and floor wax. When the doors slid open with a hiss of pressurized air, Vance was met by Sergeant Mendez. Mendez was a veteran of the old wars, a man whose face was a roadmap of jagged scars and sun-hardened skin that looked more like leather than flesh. Mendez didn't offer a salute. There was no room for the vanity of ceremony in the belly of the beast. He simply nodded and gestured toward a solitary door at the end of a long corridor, bathed in an eerie, dim amber light. "He's been waiting for you, Captain," Mendez whispered. His voice was gravelly, sounding like stones grinding together, clearly unused to the demands of frequent conversation. "He hasn't moved a muscle in 3 days. He doesn't eat the rations we slide through the slot. He just stares at the door, as if he can see right through the reinforced steel." Vance felt a bead of sweat trace a slow, cold path down his spine. He checked the retention strap on his sidearm out of habit, though he knew the ballistic glass and the triple-locked vacuum seal between him and the man inside were designed to withstand a direct blast. This was the isolation cell of the man known as El Arpon, the former strategist who had once held the entire eastern coastline in a grip of iron and blood. Unlike the communal blocks above, where the collective presence of thousands created a strange hive-like energy, this was a tomb of absolute solitude. "Why me?" Vance asked, his own voice sounding foreign and small in the cramped metallic space. "He asked for the man who brought the light to Tekaluka," Mendez replied cryptically, his eyes darting briefly to the security camera overhead. He says he has a message for the world outside that can only be carried by a man with clean hands and a soul that hasn't yet been blackened by this place. Vance stepped up to the narrow viewing slit, his breath hitching. Inside the cell, the man sat cross-legged on the bare concrete floor. He was stripped of the blue uniform, wearing only the white undergarments permitted in high-security isolation. He didn't look like the monster the intelligence briefings had described. He looked like a statue carved from obsidian, frozen in a moment of eternal meditation. But when the man's eyes shifted, slowly, with a terrifyingly deliberate grace, to meet Vance's through the slit, the captain felt the temperature in the room drop another 10 degrees. It wasn't a look of defiance or hatred. It was a look of profound, chilling recognition. The silence of CECOT was no longer a shield. It was a thin veil that felt ready to tear.
The elevator doors slid shut with a sound like a tomb being sealed. Inside, the space was cramped, illuminated by a single flickering fluorescent strip that cast long, sickly shadows across Vance's face. He pressed the button for sub-level 3, the deepest point of the facility. The descent began not with a jolt, but with a slow, agonizingly smooth motion that made his stomach flip. As the lift lowered, the distant sounds of the upper sectors, the hum of the ventilation and the muffled shuffling of the guards, faded into a heavy, absolute silence. Down here, the air felt fundamentally different. It was recycled, devoid of the scent of the sun-scorched valley or even the sterile cleaning agents used above. It smelled of cold metal and old stone. The silence here was not merely the absence of sound, but a heavy, pressurized weight that pressed against his eardrums. Vance watched the floor indicator lights blink slowly. Each number represented a layer of security, a physical barrier between the surface world and the monsters kept in the dark. Sub-level 3 was reserved for those whose names were whispered in fear across the continent, the architects of chaos who had orchestrated wars from the shadows. When the doors finally parted, the change in environment was immediate. While the upper levels were bright and open, this corridor was narrow and bathed in a dim amber glow. The walls were thick, reinforced with lead-lined concrete to prevent any form of communication. There were no communal areas here. Each cell was a solitary unit, a self-contained universe of isolation. Vance stepped out, his boots clicking on the polished stone floor. The sound seemed to travel for miles, announcing his arrival to the invisible inhabitants of the deep. A guard stood at the end of the hall, his silhouette framed by the amber light. Unlike the guards in Sector 4, this man carried no visible weapon. In the subterranean units, the primary weapon was the environment itself. The cells were designed to strip away the passage of time, leaving the inmates with nothing but their own thoughts. Vance approached the guard, who nodded curtly, and swiped a biometric card across a reader. "He's been quiet today, Captain," the guard whispered, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Vance didn't need to ask who he was. There was only one reason he had come to the lowest level of CECOT. The man in Cell 01 was the reason the prison had been built with such extreme specifications. He was the catalyst, the mind behind the violence that had nearly torn the country apart. As the heavy steel plate of the cell's observation slit slid back, Vance felt a bead of sweat trickle down his neck. He leaned forward, peering into the darkness of the cell. At first, he saw nothing. Then, as his eyes adjusted, a figure emerged from the shadows. The man sat perfectly still on a concrete slab, his back against the wall. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a scholar or perhaps a monk. But when the inmate slowly turned his head, his eyes caught the amber light. They were cold, devoid of remorse, and filled with a terrifying, piercing intelligence. Vance felt a sudden, visceral realization. The walls weren't just there to keep the world safe from the man. They were there to keep the man's influence from leaking out like a slow-acting poison. This was the true core of the fortress.
The blue light of the monitors flickered across Mateo's face, casting long shadows against the reinforced glass of the observation deck. It was 03 a.m., the hour when the silence of the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism, CECOT, felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Outside, in the rugged valleys of Tekaluka, the cicadas screamed in the heat, but inside these sterile white walls, the only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the industrial air filtration system. Mateo had worked the night shift for 3 years. He had seen the facility rise from the dust, a sprawling fortress designed to hold the unholdable. In the beginning, the sheer scale of the order was comforting. Every prisoner was a data point, every movement a calculated part of a grand machine designed to neutralize the chaotic energy of the outside world. But tonight, the data felt profoundly wrong. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the grid of screens representing Sector 4. This was the high security wing, where the most notorious figures were kept in absolute isolation. On screen 14, a man known only as the Weaver sat on the edge of his steel cot. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't even moving. He was staring directly at the camera lens, his expression a mask of absolute, chilling stillness. "He hasn't blinked in 10 minutes, a voice whispered behind Mateo. It was Elias, a new recruit who still smelled of fresh laundry starch and nervous sweat. "They do that sometimes," Mateo replied, though his heart hammered a slightly faster tempo against his ribs. "They think if they stare long enough, they can see through the lens to the people watching them." "It's not just him, sir," Elias said, pointing a trembling finger at the neighboring monitors. Mateo's gaze followed the gesture. In cell 15, a former cartel strategist was standing in the exact center of his room. In cell 16, a silent giant known for his historical brutality was mirrored in the same position. None of them were talking. There were no shouts, no banging on the reinforced doors, and no secret signals being passed through the vents. Yet, as Mateo flicked the master toggle to view the entire wing simultaneously, he saw it. 24 men, all standing or sitting in perfect, eerie synchronization, their heads tilted at the same precise angle toward the northeast corner of their individual cells. "What are they doing?" Elias asked, his voice cracking. "They're listening," Mateo whispered. He checked the audio feeds. Nothing but the white noise of the fans. He adjusted the frequency levels, filtering out the mechanical hum, searching for a vibration, a tap, or a synchronized heartbeat. For 9 chapters of this long white winter of incarceration, the order had been absolute. The government praised CECOT as the final answer to a decade of chaos. But as Mateo watched the synchronized stillness of the most dangerous men on Earth, he realized that order was a two-way street. If the guards could use it to control the inmates could use it to communicate without making a sound. A small red light began to pulse on the main console. It wasn't a standard alarm, but a notification from the deep structural sensors in the foundation. Deep beneath the concrete, something was shifting. It wasn't an earthquake, it was a rhythm. "Log it," Mateo commanded, his voice cold and professional, even as his hands began to shake. "And notify the warden immediately. The silence in Sector 4 just became a language, and I think they've just finished the first sentence." The night was no longer just a shift, it was a countdown. Mateo leaned forward, the wheels of his ergonomic chair creaking softly in the sterile silence of the command hub. He adjusted the sensitivity of the thermal sensors, his eyes narrowing as he scanned Pavilion 3. The heat signatures were steady, rhythmic, ghostly pulses of life, subdued by the weight of a mountain of concrete and high-tensile steel. To the uninitiated, the rows of inmates looked like a field of static. But Mateo knew every pixel of this facility. He knew when a shadow was out of place. His gaze remained fixed on the corner of screen 12. Inmate 402, a man known only as the Architect during the high-profile trials for his role in the Metropolitan blackouts, was sitting upright. This was a violation. At 0310, every soul in the center cot was mandated to be in a state of repose. Yet the architect sat with his back perfectly straight, his eyes wide and staring directly into the lens of the high-definition wide-angle camera. It shouldn't have been possible for the man to know the exact location of the aperture, hidden as it was behind a layer of darkened, polarized glass. Mateo's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The protocols were absolute. Any deviation from the rigid sleep schedule required an immediate Level 1 report. But there was something about the way 402 stared. It wasn't a look of defiance or madness. It was a look of recognition. It was as if the prisoner were peering through the camera, through the miles of fiber optic cables, and directly into Mateo's weary soul. The silence of the command center was interrupted by the soft, mechanical hum of the cooling fans. Mateo reached for his radio, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. To his left, the automated log tracked every heartbeat in the wing, yet the architect's vitals on the biometric display remained unnervingly flat. The machine suggested the man was in a state of deep, dreamless REM sleep, while the visual evidence showed a man fully awake, his lips moving in a silent, repetitive mantra. The center cot was designed to be the ultimate void, a place where time and identity were meant to dissolve into the white walls. For Mateo, who had spent months watching these screens, the facility was a masterpiece of order. Yet, as the clock ticked toward 0315, that perfection felt increasingly fragile. He zoomed in on the architect's lips. The cadence was familiar. It was a countdown, but not one measured in seconds. Every third movement of the inmate's mouth corresponded with a microscopic flicker in the peripheral lighting of the hallway outside the cell. It was a drop in voltage so subtle that only the system's diagnostic software should have caught it. Mateo looked at the other monitors. Other inmates were stirring now, a slow-motion ripple of movement across the white sea of uniforms. It was a synchronized awakening, silent and chilling. They weren't shouting or banging on the bars. They were simply waiting for a signal only they could hear. He finally pressed the radio button. Control to Level 2. We have a non-compliance event in Pavilion 3. Security check reveals systemic synchronization. The response was a burst of static, followed by a voice that sounded far too calm. Acknowledged, Mateo. Stay on your station. Do not initiate lockdown until authorized. The architect smiled then, a jagged expression that suggested the countdown had finally reached 0. As the main breaker clicked, the facility plunged into a thick, absolute darkness that the Salvadoran sun would never touch.
Mateo pushed back ពី console តាក្រាស់កាសប្រុសប៊ុនឧបរឿង squat ជាមួយនឹងថាំងស្មើនស្ដឹងលួតតែលឹកមួយខ្លាំងឆ្ងាវីរោលៃអំណាចបន្សល់សញ្ញាធ្វើមុលរបស់ cell 402 stable yet something felt fundamentally wrong. It was the rhythm, the pulse of the occupant. A man the files identified only as subject 704 was beating at exactly 60 beats per minute. It didn't waver, didn't spike the onset of a dream, and didn't dip into the deep troughs of REM sleep. It was a metronome in a world of variables. You're overthinking the data, Madel, a gravelly voice echoed from the doorway. Sergeant Valles stepped into the pool of blue light, a tin cup of bitter coffee clutched in his scarred hand. He had been at CECOT since the first concrete pour, a man who saw the prison not as a facility, but as a living organism that required constant, wary observation. Look at the curve, Sergeant, Madel said, pointing to the monitor. It's too clean. Even a monk doesn't have a resting heart rate this consistent for 4 hours straight. It's like he's not even there. Valles leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied the flickering pixels. Subject 704. He was a high-level strategist before the crackdown. They say he could map an entire city's power grid from memory. Valles took a slow sip of his coffee. In a place built on absolute predictability, the only way to rebel is to become a machine yourself, or to make us think you have. Mateo's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the primary thermal layer to access the high-definition acoustic sensors. He filtered out the hum of the ventilation and the distant drone of the perimeter fans. At first there was nothing but the heavy velvet silence of the pavilion. Then he heard it, a faint rhythmic scratching. It wasn't the sound of metal on stone, but something softer, flesh on fabric. "He's awake, Matteo," whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the service. He switched to the low-light optical feed. The camera, tucked into the corner of the ceiling, swiveled with a motorized whine that was usually inaudible. The cell was a stark box of white concrete. Subject 704 sat cross-legged on the floor, his back to the door. He wasn't sleeping. His hands were moving in his lap, weaving something out of the frayed threads of his uniform. "What is he doing?" Matteo asked, his own heart beginning to sync with the digital pulse on the screen. "He's passing time," Valis replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Or he's counting." Suddenly the inmate froze. He didn't turn around, but his head tilted slightly to the left, as if he could hear the internal cooling fans of the camera. On the monitor, the heart rate suddenly flatlined for 3 seconds before jumping to a frantic 120. The screen flickered, a burst of static obscuring the image for a heartbeat. When the picture cleared, the cell was empty. Matteo gasped, his hands hovering over the emergency alarm. "He's gone. Sergeant, he's—" "Wait," Valis commanded, grabbing Matteo's wrist with a grip like iron. "Look again." The image stabilized. Subject 704 was back in his original position, perfectly still, his heart rate returning to the eerie 60 beats per minute. It was as if the last 10 seconds hadn't happened. Matteo looked at the timestamp in the corner. The clock had skipped. "The system didn't glitch, Matteo," Valis whispered, the color draining from his face. "It was edited." Matteo felt a cold shiver trace the line of his spine. The realization was a jagged blade cutting through his professional composure. If the feed could be manipulated in real time, then the thousands of sensors, the thermal arrays, and the biometric locks were no longer tools of control. They were instruments of deception. He looked back at the screen, watching the rhythmic pulse of Subject 704. The architect remained motionless, a silhouette of supposed compliance, but the stillness now felt predatory. Outside, the wind of the Tekaluka Valley howled against the reinforced concrete, a lonely sound that emphasized the isolation of the facility. Inside the hub, the air conditioning continued its sterile purr, but the scent of colzone and stale coffee suddenly felt suffocating. Matteo's hand remained inches above the red alarm button, his mind racing. To sound the alarm based on a 3-second flicker was to admit the system was compromised, a confession that would bring the full weight of the administration down on his head. "Don't," Valis warned softly, sensing Matteo's intent. "If they know we've seen the skip, they'll change the method. Right now we have the only advantage that matters in this place. We know we're being lied to." Matteo slowly pulled his hand back, his knuckles white. He turned his gaze away from the monitors and toward the heavy, reinforced door of the command hub. For the first time since he started his shift, he didn't feel like a guardian. He felt like a prisoner who simply hadn't realized his cell had glass walls. The clock on the wall ticked over to 03:15, the red numbers bleeding into the darkness. The long night of CECOT was far from over, and the silence in Pavilion 3 was no longer a sign of peace. It was a countdown.
The sterile corridors of the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism had a way of erasing the passage of time. But for Elias, a veteran guard, the clocks felt heavier than usual today. The novelty of the fortress had long since soured into a grim, daily endurance. The white concrete, once a symbol of absolute order, now seemed to pulsate with a low-frequency hum that set his teeth on edge. He marched past the cells of Section 3, his heavy black boots clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. The men inside, silhouettes in white and blue, were statues of forced repentance. Yet, as Elias reached the central observation hub, he noticed a flicker in the surveillance monitors. It was a momentary glitch, a jagged line of static that sliced through the high-definition feed of the exercise yard. "Status report," Elias barked into his comms, his voice echoing in the manufactured stillness. "All systems green, Captain," the reply came, crackling with a strange interference. "Just a power surge from the exterior grid. The heat in the valley is spiking today." Elias frowned. He didn't believe in coincidences, not in a place designed to eliminate them. He turned his attention to cell 402, where a man known only as the architect sat cross-legged on the cold floor. Unlike the others, 402 wasn't staring at the wall. He was looking directly at the camera, his eyes burning with a lucidity that felt like a breach of security. The architect had been silent for 3 years, yet today his lips were moving. Elias leaned closer to the monitor. There was no audio, but the movement was deliberate. It was a countdown. The guard felt a cold shiver trace his spine. He remembered the descriptions from the prison's inauguration, how the steel and concrete were meant to be an eternal tomb for the darkness of the streets. But as he watched the prisoner, he realized that even the strongest tomb has cracks. The silence he had once described as deep seawater was beginning to feel like the vacuum before a storm. He began his rounds again, but this time he touched the walls. He felt for the vibrations. In the far corner of the south wing, near the primary ventilation shaft, he heard it, a soft metallic tapping. It was faint, nearly drowned out by the air filtration system, but it was there. It was a communication, a rhythmic signal passing through the very bones of the monolith. The architect's gaze remained fixed, an unwavering stare that seemed to pierce through the lens and into the very soul of the command center. Elias felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple, a physical manifestation of the rising atmospheric pressure within the block. He thought of the high valley outside, where the wind whistled through the jagged steel fences, a stark contrast to the stifling recycled air he breathed. Elias realized that the containment was no longer absolute. Information was flowing, not through wires or whispers, but through the structure itself. The most dangerous humans on Earth were no longer just waiting. They were synchronizing. Elias gripped his baton. The climax of this long, quiet war was approaching, and the stillness of Chapter 1 was officially a memory, replaced by a tension that threatened to shatter the very foundations of the prison's ironclad resolve.
មនុស្សនៅលើ harness មិនលៃដតមាត់ជក់បីតែអលីយ៉ាសរពេមនុស្សលៀនជំគាត់មកដាល់ក៏ការមនុស្សរីវងនេះដោយទម្រង់កាសដោយសាកោសជាប់នៃហើយចាក់រត់ទៅលើក្រុងបោងទម្រង់ស្វឹកបេតបូងដែលធ្វើឲ្យគាត់គិតថាគឺស្វិតពេកដើម្បីល្បាត់ពៀម៉ាតេអូសិតសំឡេងបេឆាដល់ហ៊ុនចំកោរំលែកអបស៊ីឌៀនគឺគាត់អ្នកគិតកាន់ឡកកាន់លាក់កង្កេធួនមែនគេហៅគាត់ថាអ្នកសាងរបត់គាត់អាចមិនចាំសម្លាក់អស់តែគាត់គិតឋានតការសាងកម្រងអេលីយ៉ាសសាត់ថយចំកោតម្រង់ស្ដាប់នៅបន្ទាត់ឋានឃាតតែធ្វើឲ្យគាត់គិតថាគឺធន់លេតគាត់មើលដោយដេកឆយដូចមានហ្វ្លុកគិតដបងគិតថាគឺមិនមានអស់ That's the neural anchor at work Mateo said ជំកោតម្រក់ផ្លើសាយយយលំឡកការប្រកួតនៅខ្លួនមនុស្សកំឡកក្នុងឆមរកគាត់គឺឆមរកបថាតដែលគេត្រូវរលាកហ្វ្លីដបងហើយក៏អស់គាត់គិតថាគេសម្លក់ទឹងអាប់ដដែលនេះគឺឆមរកគាត់ដែលយប់ឡើងរំរឹករឿងចាស់គាត់គិតថាការសម្លក់ទឹងអាប់គឺសាច់ដែលចាស់គាត់ព្យាយាមលេតគេឈ្នះទៅគាត់ចាស់ហើយដូច្នេះគេបានប្រវិតពីឆាមិនអស់តែគាត់ប្រវិតទៅភ្លួកាត់កេងអត្រាបេខាន់អេលីយ៉ាសស្ដាប់គឺក្អប់ជាងកំវៀងដែលអេលីយ៉ាសគិតឃើញគេបានប្រឌាទៅឆាគេបានលឺហើយកន្លៅទម្រង់ CECOT មិនមានវិចង់នៅម៉ាន់សូលឡើយគេនឹងគិតថាគឺមានតែគេឈ្នះទៅប៉ះនិងម៉ាន់សូលគេឈ្នះទៅស្មាក់បេតហើយត្រូវគិតថាគេមិនគិតថាខ្លួនឯងគឺអស់ Is it truly permanent or just a temporary suspension? Elias asked, his gaze lingering on the man's vacant eyes. Nothing is permanent, Mateo said, but it is efficient. We haven't had a breach in the ghost cells since the facility opened. The subjects are kept in a state of cognitive suspension. They are alive enough to be punished, but too fractured to be a threat. As Mateo spoke, the low hum of the glass cylinder shifted in pitch. It was a subtle change, a microtone that grated against the back of Elias's skull. He leaned back toward the glass, his eyes narrowing. The man in the harness, the architect, slowly, almost imperceptibly, tilted his head. In this chamber of absolute stillness, it felt like an explosion. The previously vacant stare seemed to sharpen with a terrifying intensity. For a fraction of a second, the grey iris focused, locking onto Elias's reflection in the glass. It wasn't the look of a broken man. It was the look of a predator waiting for a crack in the dam. Matteo, Elias whispered, his pulse quickening. Matteo's hand went instinctively to his holster, his eyes darting to the biometric readout on the cylinder space. Impossible. The anchor is at 98% output. He shouldn't be able to twitch a finger. But the hum was changing again, becoming erratic, a jagged rhythm that began to pulse in time with the thumping in Elias's chest. The red laces that swept the floor suddenly flickered, casting chaotic jagged lines across the obsidian. In that moment of technological instability, Elias saw the man's lips move. There was no sound, only the faint dry shape of a word being formed against the cold air of the cylinder. The word was Elias's own name, whispered in the soundless void. The floor groaned, and the clinical cold of the wings suddenly felt like a weight, pressing them toward an inevitable, dark crescendo. The silence of CECOT was no longer a peace, it was a countdown.
The fluorescent lights of the CECOT hummed with a low-frequency buzz that Elias felt in the marrow of his bones. It was a sound that never stopped, a constant reminder that in this place, even the electricity acted as a sentinel. He adjusted his tactical vest, the ceramic plates heavy against his chest, and began his patrol of Sector 4. This was the heart of the labyrinth, where the most hardened leaders were kept under a regime of absolute isolation. Outside, the tropical sun beat down on the valley of Tecoluca, but inside the air was perpetually recycled and chilled to a clinical temperature that offered no comfort to the skin. As Elias walked, his boots made no sound on the specialized rubber flooring. The design was intentional. The guards were meant to be shadows, observing without being heard. Yet as he passed the rows of steel bars, he felt the weight of 1,000 eyes. The prisoners didn't move. They sat on their concrete slabs, hands behind their heads, staring at the floor or the far wall. To a casual observer, it was a picture of perfect submission, a total victory of order over chaos. To Elias, it felt like a coiled spring, a tension so thin it was almost translucent. He stopped near a corner where the ventilation ducts converged. A faint sound reached him, not the mechanical drone of the fans, but a rhythmic clicking. Tap, tap, pause, tap. It was subtle, barely audible over the rush of air, but to a man who had spent a decade listening to the nuances of incarceration, it was as loud as a gunshot. He followed the sound, his hand hovering instinctively over his radio, but he didn't key the mic yet. He needed to be sure before he raised an alarm that would trigger a full-scale lockdown. The source was Cell 208. Inside sat a man whose name was once whispered in fear across the coastal plains of El Salvador. Now he was just a number, a figure in white cotton, his skin turning a sickly pale from the lack of natural sun. He wasn't moving, his back turned to the door, but his heel was rhythmically striking the leg of his steel bunk. Tap, tap, pause, tap. It was a code, ancient and persistent. Elias watched through the reinforced glass. On the opposite side of the corridor, in cell 209, another inmate was mimicking the motion, his finger tapping his knee in the exact same cadence. It was a bridge being built across the void of silence, communication without words, a language of percussion that bypassed the high-tech sensors and the watchful lenses of the infrared cameras. The white walls, meant to absorb souls, were now acting as a sounding board for a hidden message. "Stop," Elias commanded, his voice echoing through the intercom. The tapping ceased instantly. The man in 208 didn't turn around, but his shoulders tightened with a visible rigidity. The silence returned, thicker and more suffocating than before. Elias felt a cold bead of sweat roll down his neck, despite the frigid air. It wasn't just the two of them. As he looked down the long white corridor, he realized the stillness had changed. The inmates weren't just sitting, they were waiting. The manufactured piece of the CECOT was being hollowed out from the inside. He realized that the most dangerous thing about these men wasn't their capacity for violence, but their infinite patience. He retreated to the security hub, knowing the storm was finally gathering. Leaving the tunnel designer to his eternal, transparent vigil, they continued past the remaining glass pillars.
The obsidian floor beneath them pulsed with a faint inner light as they moved deeper into the heart of the restricted wing. Each step Elias took felt heavier, as if the gravity in this sector was calibrated to crush the spirit. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something metallic, like a machine that had been running for centuries. Mateo's silhouette remained a sharp, dark shadow against the glowing cylinders, a silent guardian of a tomb that refused to stay buried. They passed a cell where a figure sat suspended in a web of silver cables, their face obscured by a mask of shadows. Mateo didn't stop to explain the crimes. The sheer intensity of the security surrounding this individual spoke of terrors better left unnamed. Elias felt a wave of vertigo. He had come to document the world's most secure prison, but he was beginning to understand that CECOT was less of a jail and more of a laboratory for the absolute erasure of the human identity. "We are approaching the core," Mateo said, his voice a low vibration. "This is where the theoretical becomes physical. Everything you've seen so far, the cages, the silence, the discipline, it all flows from this point. This is the heart of the machine." They reached a circular door at the end of the corridor. It possessed no visible handles, only complex magnetic seals that groaned as they disengaged. When the door slid aside, the air that rushed out was unnaturally cold, carrying a hum so intense it made Elias's vision blur. Inside was a spherical chamber lined with monitors displaying flickering bio readouts. In the center, a single glass sphere hung from the ceiling. Inside it sat a man who appeared strikingly ordinary. He was middle-aged, with salt-and-pepper hair and eyes that were shut tight. "Who is he?" Elias whispered. "He doesn't have a number," Mateo replied. "He is the architect of the Great Collapse. He didn't use blades or bombs, Elias. He used lines of code and the desperation of the masses to nearly dismantle the nation. We built this entire facility specifically to hold him." Elias stepped closer. As he did, the monitor spiked. The steady green lines of the man's heart rate turned into jagged red peaks. The man's eyes didn't open, but his lips moved in a silent rhythmic prayer. "He knows we're here," Elias realized. "He knows everything that happens within these walls," Mateo said, his hand tightening on his sidearm. "We aren't just guarding him, we're keeping the world from hearing him speak." Suddenly, the lights in the chamber flickered and died. For a hot beat, they were plunged in absolute crushing darkness. Then the backup red light surged on, bathing the room in a bloody pulse. The hum rose to a screeching whine that rattled the glass. "Something is wrong," Elias shouted. Mateo didn't move. He was staring at the sphere. The man inside had opened his eyes. They weren't vacant. They were burning with a terrifying intelligence. He wasn't looking at Mateo. He was looking directly at Elias, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. Elias felt a sharp pain in his temple, a throb that matched the red lights. He tried to back away, but his feet felt fused to the floor. The architect's lips moved again, and despite the vacuum, Elias heard the words clearly in his mind. "Finally, the guest of honor has arrived."
The hallway terminated at a door that didn't look like a door at all. It was a solid slab of matte black carbon fiber, devoid of handles or visible hinges. Mateo didn't reach for a key or a keypad. Instead, he stood before a retinal scanner that projected a violet beam into his left eye, followed by a voice print sensor that rose from the floor. "Mateo, Sergeant, Alpha 90, he said, his voice flat. The slab didn't slide or swing. It dissolved into the walls with a series of muffled clicks. Elias followed him into a room that was perfectly spherical. Unlike the cold of the previous corridors, this room was bathed in a soft, pulsating amber light that seemed to breathe in sync with the ventilation system. In the center of the sphere, a single chair sat on a pedestal. It wasn't a harness or a glass cage, but a throne of absolute isolation. "This is the terminus," Mateo whispered, the heavy gravity now making his knees buckle slightly. "The end of the line for the most dangerous mind El Salvador ever produced." Elias stepped forward, his boots making no sound on the velvet-textured floor. The man in the chair was surprisingly young, perhaps only 30, but his presence filled the room like a physical weight. He wasn't shackled. He didn't need to be. The air around the pedestal was shimmering with a localized electromagnetic field that would disrupt the nervous system of anyone who tried to cross it without the proper clearance codes. "He doesn't look like a monster," Elias remarked, though his skin crawled with an instinctual dread. The prisoner's eyes were closed, his face a mask of serene, terrifying indifference. "That's the deception," Matteo replied, his hand resting on his sidearm. This man didn't use tunnels or guns. He used code. He hacked the national infrastructure, redirected the flow of clean water, and orchestrated a blackout that lasted 3 days while his subordinates moved through the shadows. He didn't kill with his hands. He killed with a keyboard. The prisoner suddenly opened his eyes. They weren't the vacant, hollow pits Elias had seen in the glass cylinders earlier. These eyes were sharp, intelligent, and terrifyingly aware. He didn't look at Matteo. He looked directly at Elias, as if he had been expecting his arrival for a long time. "He's not supposed to be able to hear us," Elias said, taking a step back as the air grew thick and heavy with static. "He doesn't hear with his ears," Matteo warned, grabbing Elias's shoulder with a grip like iron. "He senses the vibrations in the air, the temperature of your breath, the frequency of your fear. Don't engage him." The prisoner's lips curled into the slightest, most predatory smile Elias had ever seen. It was a silent acknowledgement of a hunter watching a bird fly into a cage. The gravity in the room seemed to spike, the amber light turning a deep warning red. "We need to go," Matteo said, his voice urgent. "The system is reacting to your biorhythm. You're an anomaly, Elias. You don't belong in the database, and the prison is starting to treat you like a pathogen." Elias felt a sharp sting at the base of his neck. The room began to spin as the spherical wall started to rotate, the obsidian floor beneath them shifting. The true nature of CECOT was revealing itself. It wasn't just a cage. It was a living machine designed to digest the humanity of everyone inside.
Matteo didn't use a key or a card. He leaned in, his eye meeting a hidden retinal scanner disguised within the textured grain of the door. "Access level 0, he murmured, his breath hitching slightly. The tungsten slab didn't hiss like the others. It retreated into the floor with the silent, terrifying grace of a predator returning to its den. Beyond lay a room that defied the darkness of the corridor. It was a vacuum of pure, blinding white light, an architectural scream that forced Elias to recoil. Elias shielded his eyes, the luminosity stinging like hot needles against his retinas. As his vision adjusted to the unnatural, clinical brilliance, he realized the room was devoid of furniture, corners, or shadows. In the center, suspended in the same intricate nylon wrapping as the tunnel designer, but at a much higher elevation, sat a man whose presence seemed to warp the air around him. And like the others, he wasn't skeletal or wasted. He looked healthy, almost vibrant, which made his incarceration in this bleached purgatory feel even more jarring. "This is Section 0, Matteo said, his voice stripped of his usual bravado and replaced by a hollow resonance. "He is the reason CECOT exists. He didn't build tunnels, and he didn't pull triggers with his own hands. He did something much worse," he spoke. Elias stepped tentatively into the white void, feeling as though he were walking on air, his own shadow a smudge of defiance against the floor. The man in the harness slowly turned his head. His eyes were not vacant like the designer's. They were sharp, predatory, and filled with a terrifyingly lucid intelligence. This was the Silver Tongue, the orator who had unified the warring factions into a single cohesive shadow government that had nearly toppled the nation's foundation. "He looks human," Elias whispered, though his skin crawled with an instinctive primal revulsion. "That is his greatest weapon," Matteo replied, keeping his hand white-knuckled near his sidearm.
In the cages below, we contain the muscle. In the ghost cells, we contain the brains. But here, we contain the soul of the insurgency. If he speaks 3 words to an unprepared guard, that guard is compromised. If he sees a crack in your resolve, he will widen it until your entire world collapses. He is kept in sensory isolation, except for the light. We never let him see a shadow, Elias. Shadows are where he thrives and whispers. The prisoner's lips curled into a microscopic, knowing smile. He didn't speak, but the intent was clear. He was observing Elias, measuring the weight of his fear and calculating the frequency of his heartbeat. Elias felt an overwhelming urge to turn and run, to flee back through the obsidian halls, past the glass cylinders, and out into the punishing sun of Tekoluka. "Why show me this?" Elias asked, his voice trembling in the vast white silence. Mateo turned to him, the white light reflecting in his weary, bloodshot eyes. "Because you are the historian, Elias. You are the one who will tell the world that we didn't just build a prison, we built a dam. And this man is the flood. You need to understand what happens to the world if the dam ever breaks." The weight of the responsibility settled on Elias's shoulders, heavier than the reinforced concrete. He looked back at the silver tongue, a silent god of a fallen world. The realization hit him. The most dangerous thing in CECOT wasn't the violence, but the ideas that refused to die quietly here.
បំណាយដណ្ដូរដែលចំណាយពីពុទ្ធធឹងខ្លាត់ខាងពីខុសពីគូដែលអាលយាសង្ឃឹមមិនមានពន្លឹកធ្លីឈិតធ្លីឬកម្ពស់ធួយទាត់កាន់នុកសាក់មានសម្រាប់នាំដែលផ្អាច្បាតមានកាយពពនៅពីបូកការចំណាយពីភ្នែករបស់គាត់ក្នុងចំណាំនោះមានចំណាំស្ងាត់មួយដែលណិតនាំការបណ្ដងកាយរបស់គាត់ចំណាយពីភ្នែកកម្លាំងនេះដាត់ដំណងក្រែបខ្លាយជាខ្ចាយសាយមួយដែលមានអាជាតូចដងឆ្លីឆ្លាញ់ឡើងឡាដែលមានស្មារតីសុនសិទ្ធពីភ្នែកចំណាយខាងកន្លែងមានទីនេះហើយខាងរមាស់ក្នុងដំណងនោះស្ងាត់ដាត់ដំណងមួយទៀតដែលមានមនុស្សម្នាក់ជាស់ក្នុងកណ្ដាប់ដៃមាក់ដាជ័យ This is the core, Mateo whispered, his voice stripped of his usual authority. This is the reason CECOT exists. Unlike the men in the cages, this man wore no harness. He was not restrained by steel or nylon. He wore a simple white tunic, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He looked remarkably ordinary, an elder with silver hair and deeply lined skin, but the way the light seemed to bend around him suggested a gravity that was far from normal or safe. "Who is he?" Elias asked, his heart hammering. He felt an instinctual urge to flee back through the security perimeters and into the scorching heat of the Tekoluka Valley. "The world knew him by many names," Mateo replied, stepping onto the porcelain floor with a caution bordering on reverence. He was the philosopher of the slums, the one who drafted the manifestos that united the disparate rival factions into a single engine of destruction. He didn't pull triggers, Elias. He provided the dark logic for why those triggers had to be pulled. He didn't build tunnels, but he built the mental cages they lived in. The old man on the platform didn't move, but his eyes followed them. They were sharp, piercing, and terrifyingly lucid, like polished obsidian. As they drew closer, Elias noticed that the floor around the platform was etched with thousands of microscopic names, the victims. Every life snuffed out by the orders of the man in the chair was inscribed into the foundation of his confinement. "He is the only one who is allowed to remember," Mateo continued. "In the cages below, they lose their names. Here, he is forced to carry every name he ever tried to erase. He is the living archive of their suffering." The prisoner suddenly spoke, his voice a dry rasp that echoed from the walls. "The silence is getting louder, Mateo." The sergeant didn't flinch, but Elias felt a cold shiver race down his spine. The man's voice carried a strange, hypnotic resonance, a remnant of the charisma that had once set a nation on fire. "The silence is your penance," Mateo replied. "You wanted a world under your thumb. Now you have a world of one." Elias looked at the old man, then back at the endless white dome. He realized then that CECOT wasn't just a prison. It was a machine designed to dismantle the very concept of a legacy. They weren't just locking these men away. They were unmaking the history they had tried to write in blood. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo as the scale of the psychological warfare being waged in this silent, clinical room finally became clear. He was standing at the end of a very long, very dark road. The White Ceramic Dome គឺជាការអលង្កហប់នៅលើស្បែកប្រាសាទ នេះជាបន្ទាក់ដែលមានគំមុតខួរខ្លាំងណាស់វាកបដោយតំណាក់ស្មួតអានអាតមិនឲ្យមានកន្លែងមកដល់ឲ្យប្រាសាទបានថាបែប្រទៀនមុខទេបន្ទាក់នេះតើមានការស្វែងថ្លាមកដល់ខ្លួនតែមានការដាក់យើងជាខ្មោះក៏ស្មុតពីលើតោទុកនៅលោកនេះការកដាប់មានស្មុតទុកទួយmột vỏមានបន្ទាក់ខាងស្លការស្វែងថ្លាមកតែតែទុកវាទុកធាមួយនៅលើធានោះសត្វជាមនុស្សម្នាក់តែមើលទៅក៏ដូចជាមិនសុទ្ធជាមនុស្សម្នាក់នោះទេស្បែករបស់លោកគួរជំនុំខ្លួនបែបមានសត្វតែជាក្រែមព្រួនណាស់ដោយយល់មានសត្វត្បួងកណ្ដាប់ស្បង់របស់លោកតែលោកមិនបាច់ប្រាទោះក៏ទៅទេគឺលោកប្រាកគង់នឹងស្បែកថ្លាមួយទៅដែលធំបំផុតដោយសារការទុកខ្លួនបែបនឹង This is the end of the line, Elias, Matteo whispered. His voice, usually a gravelly command, was not thin and fragile. He doesn't have a number. He doesn't have a record in the public system. To the world, he died 10 years ago. To us, he is the architect of the void. Elias stepped forward, his boots making a muffled sound on the ceramic floor. The lack of measure markers made him feel dizzy. What did he do to deserve this? He didn't pull a trigger, Matteo replied, looking at the figure with a mixture of reverence and revulsion. He was the philosopher of the gangs. He wrote the manifestos that turned criminals into martyrs. He orchestrated the Great Silence of 2018, where three cities stopped functioning, not because of bullets, but because he convinced everyone the government had already fallen. He understands that the most powerful weapon is the belief in nothingness. So the state gave him exactly what he preached, a world of nothing. The man's eyes opened slowly. They weren't clouded, they were sharp and terrifyingly lucid. He didn't look at Elias or Matteo. He looked through them, as if they were merely shadows passing across a white screen. The others in CECOT are kept here to be forgotten, Elias realized, his voice trembling as the weight of the room pressed in. But him, he's kept here to be neutralized by the light. You've turned a human being into a living monument of isolation. The most dangerous humans aren't those who use knives, Elias, Matteo said, turning back toward the hidden door. They are the ones who use ideas to dismantle reality. You cannot lock an idea behind iron bars. You have to drown it in absolute clarity until it loses its shape. But keeping him here, it changes the people who hold the keys too. It changes the nation that built this place. Elias looked one last time at the man in the center of the white. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to see a speck of dust or a smear of dirt, anything to prove that the world was still human and flawed. Here, in the heart of the prison, the pursuit of absolute order had created a living tomb. He followed Matteo out, the tungsten door sealing behind them with a final silent click, leaving the architect to his infinite blinding peace. The journey was almost over, but the coldness in Elias's soul was only beginning to set in.
In the center of the blinding white void stood a single waist-high pillar of polished chrome. Atop it sat a small, leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed and darkened by the oils of 1,000 touches. It was the only object in the room that wasn't clinical or futuristic. Elias stepped closer, his pulse of frantic staccato against the unnatural stillness. He had expected to find a monster, but there was only the book. "Where is the prisoner?" Elias asked, his voice coming out as a dry, jagged rasp. Matteo walked to the pillar, his posture stiffening into a formal salute. "He is everywhere, Elias, and he is nowhere." He gestured to the small notebook. "This is the ledger of the lost. Every single name, every alias, and every sin committed by the men in this facility is recorded here. But more importantly, it contains the one thing we can never let back into the world, their motivation." Elias looked at the book with a mix of reverence and revulsion. "You keep a detailed diary of their madness? We keep their legacies," Matteo corrected. "In the ghost cells, we strip their bodies. In the pavilions, we strip their dignity. But in this room, we strip their history. The man who occupied this final space wasn't a killer. He was a poet. A man who could turn a grievance into a revolution with a single stanza. He was the catalyst. He died years ago,
but we kept the room exactly as it was when he finally forgot his own name and his own face. Elias realized the true horror of CECOT then. It wasn't just a prison, it was a factory for oblivion. The zero wasn't a person, but a state of being. The ruthless government hadn't just built a cage, they had built an eraser. Outside, the world was supposedly safer, the streets finally breathing without the weight of shadows. But inside this vacuum, the price of that safety was laid bare. It was the total annihilation of the individual. "It's time to go," Mateo said, his voice softer now. "The air here, it starts to eat at you if you stay too long. You start to see the logic in the silence." They retraced their steps, passing back through the tungsten door, the obsidian gallery, and the mezzanine overlooking the sea of white-clad figures. As they emerged into the heat of the Tekaluka Valley, the sun felt like a physical blow. Elias squinted, the sweat returning as a welcome reminder of his own life. He looked back at the towering walls, the gray monolith that held the country's nightmares in a state of artificial stasis. Mateo stood by the final gate, his eyes shielded by dark aviators, once again the unreadable sentinel of the state. "Do you feel safer now, Elias?" the sergeant asked. Elias looked at his own pale hands, still trembling slightly. He thought of the man in the harness and the empty white room. He thought of the silence that wasn't peace, but a void. "I feel," Elias whispered, "like the world has become very quiet." He walked toward his car, the gravel crunching under his boots. He didn't look back again. He knew that while he was free to leave, a part of him would always remain trapped in that room, staring at a notebook that held the names of ghosts, wondering if the cost of order was simply too high for any human to pay.